Good afternoon. Or is it good evening? It's suddenly gone dark in here. My name is Dr. Alex Wanjala. I have the privilege to be hosting this afternoon's panel. And the title of the panel is World Makers, Future Crafters, Story Shapers. I am a lecturer in the Department of Literature at the University of Nairobi. And over the past few years, I've been dabbling in what could be called popular culture. Apart from some research that I undertake on the novel and fiction, I've been studying texts that to be found through digital media. And I've been inspired by the work of Arjun Appadurai, who once stated that the imagination has, over the past century or so, become a collective social fact due to technological changes that have led to the existence of mass medialization in the world. So if you think about it, the world changed since the days of the likes of Leo Tolstoy, who would take a very long time to write novels like War and Peace, and Anna Karenina. Not that fiction ceased to exist, but side by side with this is, the production of literary texts that are almost instantaneous, and therefore these are new forms, and increasingly so with the advent of ICT in our world. In fact, our current fear, our greatest fear at the moment is AI. Everybody is wondering, is AI taking over our jobs, the way the world is? Are these changes going to affect us professionally? And lately, especially in Kenya, hand in hand with this fear of AI, which is something, we might fear it, but we also enjoy some of the benefits that are derived from it, is the growing fear of part of society that we've labeled the Gen Zs, okay? It's interesting because I grew up knowing that that letter is pronounced Z, but now we say Z. That shows how the world is developing. So with these questions, the theme of this panel becomes quite pertinent, because we are seeing that this new generation is coming up with new ways of looking at the world, and they exploit these new media to communicate and advocate for the way they want, advocate and agitate for the way they want their future to be. So some may see this as utopian visions, or others may see this as, the way, a kind of a revolution that would definitely lead to changes in society. So we are going to try and probably discuss the philosophy behind this and link this theory to praxis with real-life examples of what the youth in East African society are doing to change the world. So, sorry for boring you with this long context, but I just wanted to throw this out there. And there are these questions of that have been, undergirding our discussions in this year's theme of Macondo, where we're trying to challenge histories and the silences that arise from the histories as presented to us. So in line with that struggle, we know that in our booklets, we've introduced all the members of this panel, but we're going to throw that aside, and I'm going to ask all the panelists here to kind of introduce themselves in a way that goes against the history and what the official description of society would give them. So I would like you to tell us something that we don't know about you. Thank you and welcome. We'll start with the person to my left and then move in that order.
Hi everyone, my name is Keith Angana, and I usually consider myself an old soul in a young man's body, mostly because I still consume many forms of media that used to exist in the 20th century, for example, or not necessarily that much in the past, but because I still read newspapers each and every morning, I still listen to the traditional radio, I still watch traditional television, and I am not that much online. Whenever I'm outdoors, I'm usually offline. So that makes me a bit distant from most of my peers with that regard, because I'm never really much at par with technology. And maybe that's why I'm fixated a lot on history. Maybe I still feel in touch with the previous self or the previous version of me that existed in the 20th century. So yeah, thank you.
Hello. Mambo. Mko fiti? So mimi naitwa Stoneface Bombaa. Nimetoka Madare ndio imekuwa mtaa. Nikijiangalia mimi naweza sema mimi ni kind of a baobab seed because I get to learn a lot from the baobab. The fact that sijaiona baobab ndogo, but kupatana nayo kiona kuna lot when I raise in my head, like how the people used to live in that community when that baobab was so young, and then saizi naiona imekuwa kubwa, so najaribu kuwa conversation ya the past life ya baobab at the present. Yeah, so mina study a lot kutokana na plants. So baobab ni one of my greatest living ancestor. Yeah, asante sana.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, you can give him a round of applause, please. Just for those who don't understand the lingua, Stoneface is telling us he adores the baobab tree, especially seeing it growing from the small size to the large tree it becomes. So he's kind of associating that to himself and his work. I hope I've translated you correctly. Thank you. Go ahead.
Good afternoon, everybody. I will just start right off the bat by saying I am Gen Z adjacent, so that there's no qualms in the room about that. But on a serious note, my name is Chao, Tayiana Minor. I am a historian. And when people ask why history, I honestly feel that there was nothing else I was born to do other than that. I spend a lot of time in the past, communicating with the past really in an intimate way. But what I also spend a lot of time doing, and sometimes I ask myself, where is this going, is thinking about the infrastructures of history, how we keep history, where we access it, who takes care of it. And so for me, history is two things. It's a subject in the sense that we can study it, but it's an object in the sense that we can care for it, we can carry it, we can change it, we can embody it. And so I straddle these two aspects of being a historian, but then being a historian who thinks about history as a living thing.
Can you hear me? My name is Soreti, Kadir, and with these kinds of discussions, the part I genuinely find the most intimidating is this part where we have to introduce ourselves in our own words. Am I audible? Not really?
Switch.
I was saying my name is Soreti Kadir, and I was prefacing my introduction with saying that the part I find most intimidating with these discussions, no matter the depth and breadth of the topic, is the part where we have to introduce ourselves. And for better or worse, I feel like it's been a long time since I've been able to come to any sort of definitive way of into presenting myself, my identity to the world. But I can say that as an artist, I started out my practice as a poet some 10-ish, maybe 11, 12 years ago, and slowly made my way into nonfiction writing, particularly focused on analyzing the geopolitics of the Horn region, particularly Ethiopia. I mentioned that I am an Oromo, I think, and just for context, the Oromo are a nation unto themselves, predominantly found in Ethiopia and the northern parts of Kenya as well, which is one of, not even the most predominant or primary reason, but one of the many reasons that Nairobi has been home for me for the last about 5 years. And yeah, I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much. I think from the conversation so far, we learned that everybody here is from East Africa, and the word history kept on creeping into their introductions. And there's also this question of growth, growing from a young tree to a mature tree, having a sort of background that leads to a sort of journey, trying to document historical processes, etc., etc. So I think it calls, therefore, for us to delve a bit more deeply into this question of history. We know that power relations underlie texts. Power relations underlie texts. So whichever story gets out there is the story, is history. I always tell my students that when I'm giving a lecture, normally, there are no cameras in my lecture theater to say that, this morning, Dr. Alex Wanjala was in class and he taught Caribbean literature to a third-year group of students. And then that would make the evening news. However, if our president was planting a tree, planting a tree is a good thing. Another example, maybe, if he was busy promising people that roads will be built 2 years from now, and everybody knows that probably never happens, because at least when I'm teaching, I've taught, but making promises of things that do not happen is now reported, and it becomes the story. So that's my very, basic take on history. History is the voice of those in power. But, those outside power do not have their voices heard. And I think most of you, at least all of you here, have been trying to work against that. So I'd like to hear it from you. What's your take on history? Maybe we could expound on that. And this time we'll start from the other side, Soreti. Yeah, go ahead.
When this is still not audible, more or less. Keith, when you started the introductions and you started from this side, I said, okay, for the questions, it's going to start from my side, so it's okay. I was reflecting on this as you were just speaking, and the first thing that came to my mind is that I'm of a community who have been at war with the dominant narrative about themselves, about their culture, about their entire existence for at least as long as I've been alive, and also that of the lives of my parents and grandparents as well. So again, being an Oromo, the state that we are from, the nation state that we are from is Ethiopia. And to put into, I guess, a really kind of clear context about what this war has felt like and what it sounded like being articulated by my generation, and particularly by myself and the organizing work that I've been engaged in for the last about 5 years, is that the very well-known story about Ethiopia is that it is the only country on the African continent that has not undergone colonialism. And this is one of the most, and I think this is really the, if I continue with this metaphor of the war, this is the battlefield on which we keep retreating and coming back and going forward. And there has not been a definitive end to this particular confrontation, because for this to be true, and this to the point of the role of power in relation to history, and that those who accumulate power or who seize the power are able to tell the stories that define everybody's lives, right? But this narrative of Ethiopia, of Ethiopia never having been colonized, is exactly the counter narrative to this that has defined my last 5 years on the African continent, in saying that it is the exact opposite of this that we find to be true. Ethiopia is the last standing colony, traditional colony on the African continent that never went through a process of decolonization. And this is not to say that the moments of decoloniality that we all met in the 1900s was by any means moments that finished the project of African liberation on the continent. But even, for the sake of semantics, or even symbolically, to have gone through a process of decoloniality whereby power was handed over to whether it's groups or parties or organizations or individuals chosen by colonials or not. Regardless, that symbolic moment of we're now free of this colonial apparatus, this was never the case for Ethiopia, because there was never an understanding about the nuanced nature of how colonialism took place, both in collaboration with the same forces that carved up the continent of Africa, and also within the relationships and dynamics specific to the Horn region, which are the dynamics that more than anything else defines this colonial era for Ethiopia. But if history tells us that Ethiopia was never colonized, then what place do I have in history as an Oromo, nor my family, nor my community have in history, if our experience is that of a colonial one? But the world tells us, and the African continent tells us, and those actually who are most excited about the conversation of decoloniality and most excited about the prospects of Pan-Africanism, have, and not just, kind of an idea or a thought about Ethiopia not being colonized, but a belief, and a kind of a belief that if unravels, a lot of other things also unravel, which is a daunting experience for sure, whether that is something you experience interpersonally or you experience about the truths you hold about the world around you. It is not an easy thing to understand something to all of a sudden no longer be true when it has been the anchor to much of what you've known to be true. But I think I will finish what I'm saying. I really want to concretize this point. And I was thinking about, we're coming up now at the end of September, beginning of October, to a Thanksgiving ceremony that takes place. It's the largest open air gathering of African people on the continent. It's called Irecha, and it's a celebration of Thanksgiving that belongs to the Oromo traditional faith religion called Waq Ifata, but participated in by people of all faith groups. It's taken on more it's taken on more a symbol of kind of identity, culture, nationalism, so on and so forth. And it's also been an event highly persecuted by the state because of its ability to see so many people from across Oromia converge in one place. But more than that also, at this time, as we come to Irecha of 2025, it's a time where power is in the hands of the group I am of, right? Like state power, that is, structural power. And so Irecha is now celebrated in Ethiopia with a lot of fanfare. There's a lot of money that goes into it. I mean, it's kind of an elitist event more than anything now, especially in the capital. And I reflect on this at this point is because even without the acknowledgement of what I'm saying regarding Ethiopia's history, having been a colonial entity, and the Oromo and many other groups, by the way, in the country being subject to this colonial violence in all of its forms, even if we didn't recognize this, we could say, wow, this is an incredible moment. It's Irecha's happening at this level of visibility, and this belonged to this group of the. But if we do consider history as extremely important and being correct about analysis of history, if there is such a thing as being correct, which I think there is, even in a world of perception is personal and can be subjective,
if we can't acknowledge that this site that Eritrea is taking place on, even in its name, yeah, with, like, for example, do not call Addis Ababa Addis Ababa. It is not the name of the city. Addis Ababa was a name given after the conquest of this land and after the ethnic cleansing of the people groups who were traditionally indigenously settled on that land. It was only after that that the term Addis Ababa was introduced, and it was in even a manner, and this is also historically important, the energy and the manner with which this language was introduced was one of boastfulness and of a victory over these people. And so this was the colonial state establishing itself as a historically correct position at that time by calling it the new flower in the Amharic language. For us, this land is called Finfinne. And Eritrea is a time where the people, the earth, and the people as a community, the earth, as also in relationship to us, but also within us as individuals, our inner lives, our inner selves, they all converge together for a moment of thanksgiving and of unity. My question is, historically, if we are not attuned to these nuances, how can this truly take place? How can Eritrea truly take place in Addis Ababa? Especially when Finfinne was the place of not just symbolic but literal convergence of the way in which the indigenous clan structure of the Oromo, and this is millions of people, 50 plus million people, there were very literal lines drawn across land whereby each of the, what we call the Oda tree, so it's a sycamore tree under which assemblies would take place, decision-making processes, similar to many African countries, kind of like the Bombaa trees function also, socially speaking. When all of these trees and all of these people groups, they found a convergence point, not to Addis Ababa, but to Finfinne. So this is my reflection history.
Okay, thank you for that, Soreti. So you bring up a very interesting and disturbing point, because we are so used to pointing fingers and saying they did this to us. But you're changing the significance of they for us, I guess, in a manner of speaking, and bringing the same, it's like the same is doing the same harm to us as we imagine they would have done. So it means that what we've been fighting for in terms of the decolonial is not really a panacea, and that now we're shifting the position from the historical perspective. Okay, sorry to go back into that again. What we know as history, the historical perspective of being the victims of, colonization, to kind of a retake on knowing that this, it's like we're exposed that even if we shift this and have this as the reality, it might not be the solution we're looking for, because that solution is proving to have been wrong. And okay, let me not go too deep into that. Yeah,
it's an interesting provocation in terms of who's accountable? Are we taking enough accountability? And when there are actors outside of those who are close to us, intimate, maybe people group, language group, it's maybe, as I'm understanding your point, it's easier to shift accountability over to that is who is the other, might have also played a role. I think Ethiopia is really interesting because even then, not even now, even then, the cognitive dissonance was so real. Like these contradictions and nuances were present at the time of the 1800s when the scramble of Africa took place. A lot of people don't know Menelik II, he was present. He was either present or he had sent official writing to Queen Elizabeth, however many there were, I'm not sure, but saying, me too, I have colonial ambitions for this region. I hear y'all are coming, I'm paraphrasing, here y'all are coming I would like to be a collaborator with you. So it was just strategically easier for the British, and this is why we see this kind of, these shifts of power, Italy, Britain, Haile Selassie, Menelik, because this was all everyone looking out for their interests and trying to safeguard as much of the accumulation of their wealth, their labor, whatever they were doing, right? But in that time also, I'm talking about this cognitive dissonance, because Haile Selassie is remembered in that time as being, I think I heard this at a Pan-African gathering and kind of a back and forth on this very topic of like, you know, he sent Air Force supports to, I believe, Mozambican resistance fighters. And so these kind of, we sort of just pick and choose. Haile Selassie's role though locally and his collaboration with particularly the British, this is why they won the war against the Italians, was because of their collaboration with the British. So I think we can't absolve, I mean, the structure, and also it's also really important to say that the Ethiopian image of self and where this idea of Ethiopia's ownership of from Sudan all the way to sometimes Zambia is even noted as how far the expansionist vision of the Ethiopian empire goes, right? This is also extremely, it's religiousized and mythologized in almost the literal same way and from the same narrative that the myths and fallacies that are now today propping up the Israeli state upon Palestinian land there's a deep connection between these two things with Ethiopia and with. What I'm saying is that even the Ethiopian image of self, and that has also been applied onto the indigenous people, and it's also been why it's so easy for them to make these decisions, and it was the desire for power was so deep rooted, is because unfortunately, and there can be arguments about this, but there is a dissonance amongst Ethiopians' imagination of even Ethiopians being African and Black. And so I think this is important to note in this, who's accountable, and whiteness and the colonial mindset has been a centerpiece actually in a lot of ways within Ethiopia's thinking of itself.
Okay, thank you for that. Food for thought. I'm sure we'll get back to that discussion later.
Thank you, Soreti. I think one thing that's really stood out for me from your introduction to your work and to how you view history is the question you ask about what place do we have in history to tell our own stories when we are told otherwise? Like, how do we occupy that space and how do we carve it out? For me, history has always been how we anchor ourselves in time to survive. And perhaps to explain what I mean by this is, I will use a story. I will take us back to the late 19th century. When we think of East Africa, when you Google East African people, what images are likely to come up? Slaves? Maybe Maasai people? You know, when you're Googling traditional, let's say Kenyan people or traditional attire in Kenya. But the late 19th century or rather the late 1800s were a very difficult time for the people of Kenya. In Maasai oral history, this period is called Emutai. And it is called this because it was literally the period of death. When we were in primary school, one of the things that came up was that, well, the Maasai couldn't resist the British because they were so far gone at that time that they didn't have enough strength, manpower, resources to do so. But I want to talk about Emutai a little bit because this period of death for me is an interesting time to reflect on the question of survival. This is a time when East Africa, or particularly the region of Kenya and pastoralist communities have been, their livestock has been ravaged by rinderpest, and then followed by a bout of smallpox, and then famine. And so you have a consecutive period of a lot of hardship, a lot of scarcity. But what happens, not just at an overall level of Kenya or Maasais or pastoralists, what happens in families? What does that period do to people? And I start with this because both my maternal great-grandfathers were given out as children in order to survive. And so because there was very little food, many people, many mothers, many parents within the Maasai community were giving their children to other people because that was the surest way for them to survive this period. And so this concept of survival, of what you have to pass on in order to survive, what you have to let go of, what you have to let go of, but also what you have to transfer to someone else, I think for me anchors my relationship with history quite a bit. because I think the theme of survival, the theme of transferring, the thing of caring for something and passing it on is a sacred act. It really is a sacred act. And I ask myself, what is my responsibility, particularly as a historian, to care for what has been given to me? Because I am a product of people who have made immense sacrifices, immense personal sacrifices in order to survive. I think in the context of history, particularly when we're looking at a people who've been separated very violently from their history, from their culture and tradition, we are looking at the act of caring, really, and taking information, taking stories, taking narratives, understanding how we exist in this world in relation to other things. And I ask myself, as a people, particularly in these categories are quite broad, pre-colonial, post-colonial, the more we understand that there's much more nuance to time. However, how different would our world be for us as a people? How different would our relationship be if we were taught and we were shown that it is our responsibility to care for our history, and that history has not been othered? It has not been kept in institutions behind glass cases, that is not the only place for history to exist. How does it then move into our lives and to the sacred space of our interactions? So this really is my interaction, my communion with history. And just to go back to the theme of survival, over time, through colonialism, through having to abandon your religion, through having to send your children into a system of education that you don't understand, what we're seeing here is the core theme of survival, and perhaps maybe it's something we can reflect on in how we survive together, not just individually.
Thank you.
Sana. I'll just go directly. So you'll forgive me. I'll be switching language between Swahili, Sheng, and English. Yeah, is it right? Yeah. How do I understand the word history? And then, which history or what history are we talking about? Is it the history that the people in power dictated on us during our school period time, or is it the organic history that forced me to understand why the historical violence exists in terms of informal settlement that I come from, like in Madare? The information or the history that we're being taught in school is really different from the one that you come to get outside here. The history in school, it was like you just have to praise the people in power. It's very directed. Like, you need to say this and don't say this. For instance, I came up with a podcast known as Until Everyone is Free podcast. And then the information that I got when I was doing research so as I can develop this podcast, it was not the information or the history that I got from school. Let's say like the work of Piogama Pinto did, that what inspired the podcast to come out. But if you study very well in high school, there's a short paragraph, just a line, mentioning Piogama Pinto as an athletic, that he won a medal or a bronze, only that. But when I came to study the history in a way that I wanted it to be heard outside here, I found like Piogama Pinto did amazing and powerful struggle to help Kenya got independent to where it is right now. Can you imagine Madare is the headquarter for the Mau Mau? Anyone with idea? Anyone? But the history in school is very deep, and it doesn't mention that. But Madare, we have inherited a lot of injustices and violence simply because of its structure, simply because of how it was developed, how it was constructed to be the way it is. early in the days, Madare was a quarry. You know, the fine stone that was extracted from Madare developed the urban spaces that we are in the CBD and the posh areas in Nairobi. But go and look where this stone came from. People live like a disposal. People living like you just need to survive, not to live a dignified life. So that challenged me to understand, like, we need to construct our own history as a Madarian people. We need to rewrite our own history. We need to document our story, you know. We know, like, we have passed, as I mentioned earlier, we've passed a lot. We've passed so much in terms of violences that have been forced to our side. We have lost so many people. We've lost so many young people. I mean, like, even in my age, it's so lucky for you to be around 25 years old. For you to be here, Manze, you need to thank God, because you have really escaped extrajudicial execution. You have really escaped unregulated drugs and crime. So young men in the community are being forced to, not even to survive, you know, because they're connecting, because Madare was the hub of the Mau Mau. So anyone comes from Madare is a descendant of the Mau Mau. So we are not being given that opportunity to explore. You're not given that chance to even live a dignified life. We're being forced to see the violent side of everything. So what motivated me to come up with this podcast, as I was walking around at the Macmillan Ukombozi Library, I got this powerful book known as Kenyan Unsung Matter, written by Shiraz Durrani. And it was talking so much powerful concerning the Madare history. I wanted this information to reach the people in the community, and how powerful will I construct this history to them to understand. Thus, I came up with Sheng language, Sheng as a resistance language, because it's talking about the people in the community. So that was one way of deconstructing our own history, writing our own history in a way that we understand best, and then people can inherit that and pass it down to the coming generation. Yeah, so I can say, like, there's a boundary between understanding the real history and the difference between the history that the people in the power are passing toward us. Yeah, so that's what I can say for at the moment. Yeah.
So history, to me, I'd say it is cyclical. And for that reason, I usually have a favorite quote in regards to history. And this is a quote that was said by George Santayana, where he says that those who do not study history are doomed to repeat it. Yet those who study history are doomed to watch helplessly as others repeat it. And so the thing about this is, for example, we can have quite a number of anecdotes on that. For example, the last 2 years in Kenya have mostly been, the political scene has been dominated by the protests that happened or that were led by the Gen Zs. And you see, the thing is, most of the postulations were that, well, the Gen Zs are the most educated generation at the time because they benefited from free education, and then they got to this age where now they're finished school, and then now there aren't jobs in the economy because the economy hasn't expanded, and so that's why they went onto the streets to protest. And when you look back 100 years, first of all, when you start by looking at the first ever class of educated Africans, that was in Maseno School in 1906, when since they ended up being the first batch of educated group in society, when they finally came of age, they mobilized together. They formed the Young Kavirondo Association, the likes of Eli Daniel Ojeje Oteko, the likes of Benjamin Owuor, Simeon Nyende, and together they started now mobilizing for reforms towards at that time it was the Nyanza Provincial Commissioner and towards the colonial governor at the time. And they started going on protests, and eventually, well, they did submit their memorandum on what exactly they wanted for change, but eventually the group was infiltrated. If any of you knows, the Young Kavirondo Association eventually changed to the Kavirondo Taxpayers Welfare Association, because there was some infiltration from the colonial government. I think they imposed Deacon Owen and then Akaharibu Haribu. And then when you look at now with us, even the 2024, 2025 protests, there was some mobilization. There's similarity in the amount of education, there's similarity in the vast education among the young people. And then eventually there's some infiltration from insiders by the government. You see that there is a lot of similarities between the history and the present. Even when you look at, for example, the current economic situation, you look at how the government has removed funding to education, funding to healthcare, because of course the IMF want us to pay them back the loans. When you look back 30 years ago or 40 years ago, when the Moi government took out loans and then the IMF imposed SAPs on us, the structural adjustment programs, and now the government had to cut funding to education, had to cut funding to housing, and you see some similarities in how all this happens. And so history basically is cyclical. And I feel like it is important for us to study history so that we can not repeat the mistakes that we made in the past. And that's the main reason I actually study history and why I feel it's important for many people to learn. It's very important for many people to learn. And then one of the second reasons why I love studying history is something we call psychogeography. So psychogeography is basically how the geography of a place affects people psychologically. For example, one of the most convenient streets in the Nairobi CBD, we might say it's Kenyatta Avenue. So during the construction of Kenyatta Avenue, the Nairobi administrator at the time, John Ainsworth, his plan was for that street to be exactly like a boulevard in London. And that's why, of course, when you walk along, you'll notice that most of the buildings in Kenyatta Avenue have that neoclassical architecture because his vision was that. But then when it came to the construction or the streets that were close to Nairobi River, mostly they were left for the Asians or for the coolies or for the railway workers. And so there wasn't much care given to them. And even now, like Nairobi the CBD is demarcated, there's uptown and there's downtown. And so this has affected our psychology towards this. Like you have that feeling of ease when you walk along Kenyatta Avenue or when you walk on Koinange or Mindimbing or these other sides. But now when you get to downtown or when you cross Moi Avenue, there's that sudden change. And so getting to learn why this came about to be and how this affects our psychology is very important. And that's why we should all study history.
Okay. Thank you very much. You know, the good thing about these people seated here on the stage is that they have assessed history and how history has kind of, given a false representation on some aspects of life and society. And if you dig or delve deeper into their lives, they are active agents in trying to make some changes to this using various medium, through podcasts, through journalism, through storytelling, and through poetry. Due to lack of time, we're not going to delve deeper into that because this is an interactive forum, and I would like to give some time for questions from the audience. So I hope that these aspects come up during the question and answer session. It is, after all, a literary festival, so we'd like to know more about the medium that they use and how it's supposed to transform society. So I'm going to give some time for questions from members of the audience. I can't see you right now, so I don't know how this is going to work out. I assume there are microphones in the audience, but I can't see you. So, okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you to a most informed and informative panel. I've really enjoyed everything that has been presented. One of the things that I'm really happy because listening to all of you, because very often our generation, the older generation, bemoans the fact that we have failed you. We have failed, we haven't passed on the knowledge that we need to pass on. So I'm glad that that is not true with you guys. The question for all of you, you've all said, we all know, and you've all said that the educational systems are not the source of the information that you have, are not the source of the knowledge that you have gained. What have you done? What did you do as individuals to break through the knowledge barriers that exist, to go beyond the very feeble history or knowledge that is presented at school, and to get to where you are now, to have the depth of knowledge that you have now? My name is Tayiana Mwali.
Okay, hi, good afternoon. My name is Dorina, and I just want to appreciate our panelists for bringing in this question of the history and right now what is happening in the literal sector. So in the past session that we had, I just noticed, I learned about identity as Africans, and through all the modes of communication, all literal activities that we are participating in, that is filmmaking, storytelling, and all podcasts and everything, that I believe is a high time we take up our identity as Africans. First of all, we take up identity as Africans because we tend to lean on the other world, what is telling us to do, instead of us practicing what we have, the history that we've had in the past, and bringing it to life and helping our young ones, even us as youngsters, to identify with ourselves, and then also to move it on and pass it on to the other generations. So my question is, what is the main thing that you're passing through? Because there seems to be a confusion. You find that we are learning from the other world's literal sectors, what is happening around the world and everything. But what are we doing to our generation, African generation, to just make sure we maintain our identity as Africans and bring to life these stories that we are coming up through different modes of communication? Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Arunga Dennis. You know, history is really essential for us to understand where we came from and where we are going to. And honestly, history is vast. And if you try to devour all history at once, chances are that you'll choke. So to anyone who's curious or who's interested to get into this path of like knowing more about history, where is the ideal place to start? Thank you.
Hopefully that's not a lot of questions, because I'm going to add another one. My name is Mutinda. My questions are just to Stoneface, Bombaa, hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. My question is, you've mentioned you're from Mathare, and you started the podcast until it's free. So my question is, you are a voice for, I don't know if Matharians is a name, but Matharians, guys from Mathare. Are you a voice for Matharians to the outside world, or are you a voice of Matharians to Matharians? In regards to that, I've noticed you've mentioned how you use Sheng as a language to convey history of Mathare people to them, I think. So that's in regards to the podcast you mentioned, because I think I've seen the podcast online and the kind of settings, and I think you've had like a physical event somewhere, somehow. So are there any things you do to make sure, if your audience is the people of Mathare, to make sure it gets to them? Because even from the name itself, well, it's giving this other side of not Mathare, you know what I mean? So are there systems in place? Also, the name itself, and are there any structures that you try to make sure, if it's for the Matharians? If it's not, then I guess that makes sense. So that's just my question. In regards to when you're making this information available, as there was a question that was asked, how you guys are making this information available, How do you tailor it for your people, if it's meant for your people? Or is it a tool that you're using to make sure the outside world understands the story of your people and how you navigate between those two things? Thank you.
Okay, let's keep our questions brief, please. There are two more. We'll take two more from that side. Just.
Hi, my name's Tom. Yeah, thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to listen to this conversation. I think something I'd really like to ask Chao in particular is, in thinking about history and interpreting history today, so much of the historical sources that we know of, right? So much of the time that we first think about history, we think about written history, which has this objectivity that we at least project onto it. So much of that is not available here, right? So many of those sources are now locked away in vaults in London or Belgium or wherever. And instead, we think a lot about, okay, how do you now integrate oral history? And so my question for you is, how does working with oral history change how you think about truth and objectivity within history itself? Because of course, people's experiences are inherently messy and subjective. Thank you.
My name is Madoni, and thank you very much, panelists. And my question is so similar to what Tom has asked that I will just add a small thing, which is to say we're developing a history series for for children, and the biggest challenge has been how to make narrative sense so that it's a story that is understandable when you've had very flimsy sources and then flimsy written sources, and then primary sources that, that face the challenge that Tom has articulated. So I just wanted you to talk about that.
Okay. Yeah. Last question. Sorry.
My question is to Keith. When you're talking about how history is cyclical, when the protests were happening this year and last year, not everybody, but I can say there's a certain demographic of Gen Zs who think that maybe they're the first to do these things, they're the first to have this thought process, almost I can say, basically saying that the older generation has never tried anything. Why do you think that disconnect comes in? Is it because history isn't accessible? Why do Gen Zs think that maybe they're the first ones to do this and they put off older generations? When we look at history, it's happened before. So where's that disconnect of people not knowing that these things are in history and have happened before?
Okay, thank you very much for those questions. What we're going to do is this. There are so many questions, you're so many panelists. We're going to pick at least one question and try and spend a maximum of 2 minutes for each person answering the question. So just think about it, don't repeat an answer that has already been given, and we'll try and save on time in that manner. Thank you. Over to you. I don't know where we're starting from this time, decide yourselves. Okay.
I will answer the question that has been channeled to me by Mutinda. If I say Mathare, Mathare to me is like a study case of the violences that is happening in the country and into the world in general. Because I do believe injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. And then to add up, like, what are we doing at least to ensure things are not repeating itself, right? So coming up with this podcast as a voice for Mathare is to spark a conversation, a global conversation, of course, even what is happening with the Palestine, what is happening with the Black Lives Matter. We have been losing life ever since. My age is generation 4, and inheriting the violence, systemic violence. And if you see how Mathare was designed, it looked like an urban concentration camp. everything that used to be happened during the concentration camps during the Mau Mau is actually happening even to date. The difference is Madare right now is an open, kind of an open prison. So I could not just sit back and say this information is only for Madare. No, it was just to spark a conversation, a global conversation. Just taking the struggle from the scratch, because I interact with the violence in Madare in day-to-day life. So I'm just taking that conversation to a global platform. We have seen the Gen Z protest. We've been demonstrating even before the Gen Z movement came to exist. I remember we've been tear gassed so many times at the Jivanji, around Kenyatta Avenue, when we were going to seek justice for the people who have lost in Madare. But a lot of the people in the country was like, that's not our struggle. That's the struggle for the people in the informal settlement like Madare. Until when we lost life, Boniface Mwangi, Rex, people now coming out, we're like, how I saw it is like a continuity of what we've been fighting for. Yeah, so Madare to me, it was just a studying hub. Yeah, I think I've answered your question. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think I'll go on to answer Jean's question. So you were asking about why most of the Gen Zs feel like they're the first to do this. So one of the reasons that influenced them, first, maybe the current reason that influenced them is because when the protests were happening, so most of those who went to the streets, there was some, not really rebellion, but most of their parents denied them the chance to go to the streets because there was they were telling them about how the government might kill them and how whatever might happen to them based on what the Moi government did. And so for some reason, this gave them the perspective that the Gen Zs might be the first group in Kenya to actually go against the green. And secondly, of course, there's the reason that Stoneface Bombaa mentioned about how the education system didn't have as much information as was needed. For example, I can remember the history when in History in Form 2, when we talk about constitutional changes since independence. So the only thing that's mentioned in 1992 is that, or 1991, is that Section 2A was repealed. There isn't a whole history on how the Sabasaba movement started and what exactly happened at that time and who exactly was out in the streets and the whole process. It's just Section 2A was repealed. So the lack of enough content in history in schools contributes towards that. Well, actually, I think that's the main contributor towards it, the lack of content in history. So yes.
I will answer two questions together. The wonderful question from Sitawa and the other question from Tom, which for me is a very important and intertwined aspect of what we're talking about around historical sources. 10 years ago, or let me say 15 years ago, I started my career. At that time, I didn't think it was a career, but I started what would be my career as a historian by writing a history blog. And one of the themes that I was looking at was the history of the railway in Kenya. I would go to the National Archives, I find records on the railway, and then I interpret them, curate them, and share them on my blog. In the months that I was doing this work, another question was kind of gnawing at me. I was living in Voi, and I decided, let me go and see the Voi railway station. I've been writing about this railway, but I have no physical context of this infrastructure, so let me go and see it. And what I found was both jarring and intimidating in ways that made me reflect on the work that I've been doing. I found a station that was barely functioning. It was on its knees. The parts of the station were dilapidated. Things were falling apart. And I thought, there's a bigger question here. There's a bigger question about this infrastructure, but there's also a bigger question about memory. And so my work expanded quite rapidly and literally from being a blog in which I'm just referencing archival material into being an active and quite a forceful way of engaging with how the past was manifested in the present. And I went around the country looking at railway stations and how Kenyans particularly remember them in the context of a history that is replete with romantic narratives about man-eating lions. But this railway has served Kenyans for well over 80 plus years. What do we remember about it? And so the question of oral history and sources became much more about human experience than a single truth. In some parts of the country, people would associate the railway as a relic, something that is dead. Like, why are you interested in these buildings? They don't matter anymore. And in other parts of the country, like Western Kenya, my interest in the railway was taken as, does this mean the government is reviving it? You know, so what I was seeing as a relic, someone was seeing as an infrastructure that is key for their survival and needs to come back, you know. So I think that the wave between fact, truth, I think how we counter that is to really hone in on human experience, because that's where the questions really are. And there's also a question very briefly about sources and flimsy sources. I think that also comes into fore when we look at whose narrative are we centering. Are we more interested in a broader picture, or again, are we interested in the human experience of this particular time? Because that's where the questions are. And Stoneface asked us a very important question, which is where do the stones come from? The stones and the infrastructures that we inhabit, how do we ask ourselves questions about the spaces, the country, the systems we inhabit? And so sometimes I do feel like the questions and the silences are the place to start. They're not the thing to avoid, they're really the place to start.
So I want to respond to the first question that was asked about otherwise sources of knowledge when it is collectively known that mainstream forms of education are not providing us with enough information to be able to understand the truth about the past or to make any accurate analysis about the present moment. In my context, I found myself reflecting on kind of two I guess, ways of acquiring knowledge as an Oromo, particularly about our history as Oromo people. One still is actually studying the music. A lot of, because the Oromo language was under an official ban until 1991 in Ethiopia, so material, very difficult to create material, written material in the language in the country to document the experiences of people at the time, but people were making music, and through this music, references of, for example, a very famous song of an artist who was assassinated by the state about 5 years ago, Hachalu Hundessa, he says, "Gulalen Kantufa," and it's just this one line in a song, but in and of itself, it's a historical archive. He's saying Gulale belongs to a person called Tufa, and Gulale is a place in so-called Addis Ababa in Finfinne that he has a connection to through his clan identity. And so this is just to give you an example of lines, of words, of historical figures. There's another person who I would never, I don't think anything written about this historical figure. She was she was a freedom fighter in the 1900s, Marame Harka, and I would have never known about her if it wasn't for a song by someone named Tinkisa Debela. So just to, I can give example after example about how, particularly as Oromo music has been an archive that has been very, very active, played an active role in my being able to then ask the right questions to bring into literal existence people who I might otherwise have died, never knowing about, and whose contributions to the national project have been extremely significant. The other point is seeking out people. And I was really thinking about this because I said, okay, well, there's a lot of things that you seek stories through people of that maybe are written or you can read about. And I said to myself, just sitting here right now, that I would still probably rather hear these accounts from a person if there was such an opportunity, right? Like I've read, countless papers, not so many books because they're not so readily available about the Derg time, about Haile Selassie's time, Menelik's time. But the things that really stick out to me are the stories that I've heard from my elders, either from my parents or from people when I say I seek out people when I want to learn about a certain topic, it can get a little bit dramatic in that there was a time where, and it's still in that time, writing a paper through the organizing work that I do with the Oromo Democratic Revolutionary Party, which is an ideological platform that I founded. When we were I was trying to write about the intersection of Eritrea, Sudan, and Ethiopia. I lived in a place where the Eritrean population in Nairobi is significant enough that I would, to the point where in that suburb, I'm kind of known as the girl who just goes around asking, hey, do you want to come have a conversation with me about Eritrea? It's to say that seeking out people has been a really fundamental way that I've been able to bridge the gap in knowledge. When we wrote the paper, the second position paper of this party as well, and in the specific task of this paper was to identify the intersection between, if there was one, to create it, between dialectic Marxism and also what we call argarageti in the Oromo conceptual framework. Argarageti means to hear and to see. It's literally a methodology of creating and archiving knowledge. And when I saw that potentially there was a connection between how, as African people, we could materialize the dialectics of Marxism, and in terms of as a way politically to analyze our society, but as the Oromo, maybe we could do it through Argarageti. I had to find somebody, and I sat with this elder who's the protege. Sorry, I'm talking a long time. He is the protege of Dabasa Guyo, who's the last cultural keeper of this level of Oromo wisdom and law, who was kidnapped and disappeared in Nairobi about 20 years ago, actually. And when I found the person who was studying under him, I ended up sitting with him in a little kibanda in Eastlands every Wednesday at 12 p.m. for the whole time that I wrote that paper. So this is some of the ways that I've been able to bridge that gap to that first question.
30 seconds.
I just wanted to clarify or to say something on this, like in all of the conversations that we just come up with right now, it's like we are all the victim of misinterpreted history. So we just need to apply what Fran Fanon mentioned, like each generation must discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it. Sinisa. Yeah, that's how.
Okay, thank you very much to our panelists. A happy clap for them. A hearty clap, rather. Yeah, so we've had the privilege of listening to individuals seated in front of us who act as people who bridge the gap between individual and collective senses of the imagination. We could say that the people seated in front of us are now acting as cultural ambassadors in East Africa. And as we can see from the different sources they use, that they're actually transnational. They are transnational actors because their experiences are collective and they go across the borders. And they are also post-national because we heard one of them even speaking in Sheng, which is a language that is being captured in development. It's a future language. Right now we say it's a Creole, but it will become a future ethnic. And this shows the cosmopolitan nature of the struggle being engaged in by these youth who are using various forms of media to express themselves. So thank you very much. It has been a pleasure sharing with you this evening.